Hey y'all, DT Neal here again with storytelling things, writer stuff, genre, preoccupations, sticking again with fantasy. As I said in the other post, how geography is, or at least a love of geography, is really critical for doing fantasy work. Another thing is love of history. And history is critical to fantasy, and it's more than just character backstory. It's a whole pile of historical knowledge. There's like legend, there's myth, there is known history, there's unknown history, there's secret history, and it's enmeshed in it. And I think if you're a reader who loves history, as well as geography, but if you love history, that fantasy is absolutely a key genre because it's steeped in it. And it's funny for me when I've worked on my own fantasy stuff, fantasy stories. I always feel like I have multiple lanes that I put out. There's like the history that everybody knows about. This is like the known history. And that's generally the shared, agreed upon tapestry of information that people might have to make their way in the world. And then there's also the unknown history, or the history that's only known by a few people, or the history that's known by people who are very well versed in history. And that's a deeper wisdom than the everyday people might have. And then beyond that, there's another layer of history, which is, for me at least, it's tied to things like magic and legend and understanding. Like, because you could look across a swamp and see some kind of structure in the swamp in the distance, and people say, "Oh, that's the cursed castle." And people on that everyday level say, "Oh, watch out! Don't go to the cursed castle. People have died there." And in the deeper history, somebody might know, oh, that castle actually belonged to a wizard, you know, or somebody, and they got into trouble, and then the castle became a ruin. And then you go deeper into the deeper still into the history, and you would understand as the writer of the story, oh, that castle here's the real story about that castle, and that information may not be known by anybody in the world except you as the writer. And then there's like another lane between that utilitarian knowledge. There's also how that place plays into the larger streams that you have created in terms of the world building. I like that kind of stuff. I like the idea, like you could find a sword, and on the face value, it's a sword. But if it's a magical sword, if it's something like that, then there's the history. Who made that sword? When did they make it? How old is that sword? What was its intended purpose? Who wielded it over the span of that weapon before it comes into the hands of the protagonists or antagonists? You know, what is the history of that sword? I'm using a sword just because it's an easy reference to make, but that's that part that gets at what I was just talking about, and the many layers that you can put onto something, and the satisfactions that brings, both as a creator and as a reader of it. You want to know those things. You want to know that history. Where did this come from? What's it all about? How will that impact me? How will that impact other people? The richness of that is what produces, I think, interesting fantasy. Now, the thing that's interesting or dangerous, perhaps, is those expository rambles that can occur can absolutely derail a story. And so I'm always mindful if I have something that has a deep historical resonance, I will sprinkle out little details here and there in the story so as not to disrupt the narrative too forcefully. Because you don't want to go, me personally, you don't want to go on a 4-page discursive ramble about the forging of a particular sword. I mean, you can, and plenty do discursive rambles on all sorts of things, but if you're trying to push a story forward, you need to just give little snapshots, little glimpses, little tastes. And I personally feel like I'd much rather braid that legendary stuff into aspects of the story, maybe a throwaway line here, a little bit there, just so in aggregate, a reader who's working their way through the story can go, oh, there's this, and this, and all of those things come together for the reader to have a greater understanding, versus the writer telling the reader in one massive multi-page expository journey about a particular story. Like for me, that just, it's when writers do that, it's always like, oh God, here we go. I'd rather get to the getting, honestly. But for me though, whenever I work on a fantasy story, I have notebooks that document the history. I have the cultures, the weapons, the items, various things of the lineage of those things and the history. Because I remember personally when I was a kid, and I was technically too young when I read The Lord of the Rings. Honestly, that was like a collateral damage effect for me. Playing D&D, and then like, ooh, I gotta read Lord of the Rings. And I did, but I was young. I was like 9 years old. And I read like The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, in that period of time. But one thing that I absolutely loved were those appendices that he had, where he had timelines and dates. And, this happened and this happened and this became, this person became that, and all of that. That stuff I loved. I greatly enjoyed that, as much as I loved the maps. And so for my own purposes, when I've done my fantasy work, I've done timelines, I've done origins and all those things. And that information may not be known by anybody except the most accomplished sages and scribes in the world, who might have a true understanding, or great wizards who might understand the way of the world is working. But all of that pre-production work has to be there. And sometimes when you're writing the story, you go, oh, well, you write something, go, that's a kind of a cool thing, I got to explore that later. And then you just park that and save that and fill it out as you need to. But that kind of trail marking, the historical trail marking of a fantasy story, is really fun. It's one of one of the pleasures and treasures of fantasy, is that idea of, well, where did that come from? It just looks like this, but that doesn't seem significant, but it actually is significant because it's tied to a greater, there's much more beneath the surface than one might realize. So, if you don't love history, I can't even imagine anyone reading fantasy unless they are just throwing themselves willfully into like a power fantasy idea. But you have to like history, because fantasy is utterly tied into historical narrative. That whole idea of like, there was a great time but now it's all in ruins. How did it get in ruins? Of course, the hubris of man, or whatever, however you want to explore, whatever themes you want to explore, the danger of magic. And I can speak at length about magic theory, but I'll save that for another post, because I could really get woolly on that one.